Hi, I'm Alana Hippensteel from Pharmacy Times, and joining me is Dr. Bia Labate, the Executive Director of the Chacruna Institute and Public Education and Culture Specialist at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, as well as Kelan Thomas, Associate Professor of Clinical Sciences at Toro University, California College of Pharmacy, and board certified psychiatric pharmacist, as well as a part of the Chacruna Chronicles editorial team. They're both joining me to discuss the psychedelic medicine market and the future outlook for the field. So, Kellen, what does the psychedelic medicine market in the United States look like today?
Yeah, so the biggest thing in terms of market is the FDA approval process. So actually this week is the American Society of Clinical Psychopharmacology annual meeting, of which I just left for this meeting, and they're discussing medications like MDMA and psilocybin that are both gotten FDA breakthrough designation status. And so a recent data bridge report that kind of looks at financial outlooks and markets estimated market growth in psychedelic medicine from or psychedelics in general from 2 billion in 2019 to 6.8 billion dollars in 2027. So there's all these different aspects. There's the medicalization, the traditional FDA approval pharmaceutical route. There's companies that may be pursuing routes similar to the cannabis dispensary route as places potentially have opportunities for use, such as the psilocybin initiative, which is going through the Oregon Health Authority. So there could be all kinds of ways that the marketplace rolls out and all kinds of different uses.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And also, does the pharmacist or the pharmacy play a role in that market? And if so, what is that role?
Yeah, so particularly psychiatric pharmacists, but pharmacists in general will definitely play a role in psychedelic medicine when these become FDA approved for psychiatric indications. So MDMA for PTSD is likely going to be first, and then psilocybin for depression would likely be next. And so if they become FDA approved, there will be this risk evaluation and mitigation strategy similar to what we've seen with medications like esketamine that will basically have sort of rules around what the medical use in a clinic setting will look like. And so pharmacists would be involved in the same ways that we think about adverse drug reactions, drug-drug interactions with any medication, as well as things like REMS specialty pharmacies will be the ones, sort of procuring and dispensing and sending these medications to clinics for in-clinic use once these FDA REMS are set up.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. And Bia, has the rise in mental health conditions during the pandemic accelerated research in the psychedelic medicine field?
No, actually, what happened is that you had to stop or put on pause some of that research. So it was like other areas of life damaged by COVID, and I think even more than that, we will have to have more mental health treatments for COVID-related anxiety and stress, but potentially also psychedelics could play a role. And so there's people talking about different protocols. Some thinking how different substances and certain contexts could help people mitigate the suffering from COVID. And of course, in the underground and not so formal world of medical doctors and pharmacists, there was a lot of discussion on what would be the appropriate uses of psychedelics. Can you do ketamine at home, for example? Can you have a ketamine therapist over the phone and talk to him? And or can you have a sitter just at home or contact? And there's sparkled a lot of discussions with some pro and con, and some people really thinking that this was opening the possibilities for other forms of treatments, and others feeling that on the contrary we need to keep standards high. And so it certainly has created a lot of conversations, not perhaps not the advancement of formal clinical trials, but the field continued to sparkle and to be vibrant around all those topics.
Right, right. Um, Kellen, how does the psychedelic medicine market in the United States compare to other countries around the world in terms of acceptance and adoption within healthcare?
Yeah, so in terms of sort of the medicalization model, the US and the UK have been doing a lot of clinical trials in this area. And there's actually, roughly in terms of when you look at things like psilocybin, there's about 40 clinical trials in the US and almost 20 in Europe at this time. And then when you look at MDMA trials on clinicaltrials.gov, for MDMA, there's 49 in the US and 28 in Europe. So it gives you a sense of the scale in terms of that there's a lot of trials occurring in the US and some also starting up in Europe at large, but the UK and the US were pretty early, and the US has, even back in the 90s, was doing some small phase one safety studies with things like psilocybin and MDMA at UCLA Harbor with Charlie Grobe. So there's this change in the medicalization aspect, but then you think of a place like the Netherlands, where you can go into a shop and just get psilocybin over the counter, almost like a dispensary model, where you just show up and you can buy psilocybin, and there are research places happening there in terms of sort of real world use type research, as well as retreat center type models where people can just go buy their own psilocybin truffles from a shop over the counter and then go to some retreat or go to some clinician and potentially take the psychedelic under their supervision for something like psilocybin. So there's a lot of different potential models in terms of how this could all roll out, whether it's community based or the FDA approved medical clinic models. These are all things that different countries are looking at this time.
Yeah, I want to jump in and, Kellen and I complement each other's in our knowledge. And as an anthropologist and somebody that runs a nonprofit related to psychedelics, I just also invite us to rethink of what we understand by psychedelic market. Because if we're talking just about, is this a business, or is this commodified, or do we have a structural and criminal and medical system around it? Or are we talking about the use, which might involve some kind of exchange and some kind of monetary transaction, or some kind of system of reciprocity, or gratitude, or traditionally a shaman will take somebody as an apprentice, and this apprentice is going to work in his farm and help him with the chicken. And so all of this is a market, or in some there you have, when you say market, it seems to reduce to a certain kind of use, but you have in South America widespread use of plants and different traditions, shamanic traditions. In Brazil, you have the context of the Brazilian ayahuasca religions, which are Christian syncretic manifestations that combine indigenous with Christian and European esoteric and Afro religions. So there's a whole set of groups. Maybe 500,000 Brazilians already tried ayahuasca. And so is that a market or not? But certainly there's a lot of activity. There's a lot of people consuming. There's a lot of Americans going to Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil to drink ayahuasca. And so small scale, not really, like some have tried to call this an industry, but that's disputable. It's part of the discussion. So there's a lot of other things happening in all continents, in all places habited on Earth, involving psychedelics. And just wanted to remind that to take a little the focus out of just the medical profession.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
Yes, a lot of religious use, and even clinical trials also in the medical model down in Brazil as well. So there's also clinical trials in South America.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so, Bia, how is the acceptance of the potential psychedelic medicines for the treatment of mental health conditions in the United States compare to some other countries around the world?
well, I think that's hard to say. I think the entire globe somehow is influenced by the drug war and by the main paradigms that guide all nations, which is signing the UN conventions and signing off to the scheduling of drugs. This is perhaps one of the conventions from the UN that has the highest level of acceptance. So people will dispute a lot around environment or other kinds of issues, but when it comes to drug, there seems to be this massive cohesion uh, in the whole globe towards accepting the scheduling. And there's also some countries that are still very conservative and put traffic dealers in death penalty and don't accept the idea of harm reduction. So the whole understanding around the substances is very much influenced by the drug war, and by the drug war is informed not by scientific understanding of what the substances are. I mean, there has been multiple papers and dozens of peer-reviewed articles showing the fallacy of this scheduling system. So the scheduling system is not a product of scientific, objective, rational, neutral evaluation of the substances or their risks, but rather it has a whole history that has economic, social, geographic, historical legacies. And the drug war is very much informed. It's a cultural war. It's a moral war. It has a religious, backdrop. So uh, all the countries are battling against the same common denominator, and there's variations on how each country is dealing with that. I think what is interesting about the United States is that the United States is the world leader of the drug war, but it's also here that we're starting to combat some of this more this absurd of this classification. So first of all, cannabis, there's a big cannabis reform, and now psychedelics are kind of breaking through. There's a multitude of decriminalization initiatives throughout the whole country. There's the advancement of clinical trials. So in general, I think there's a lot of positive um, developments. And to conclude, when it comes to the health system, the U.S., as we all know, has a very unfair medical system that doesn't really favor access and has a lot of paradoxes in comparison to other countries. It's not as developed, it's not a progressive, inclusive, human rights kind of medical system. So when you have this approved into the current medical system, it will be under the same paradigms and parameters of healthcare in general in this country, which don't favor the poor, as we know. And you have other countries in Europe, for example, that have a more universal access, or even Canada. Brazil has a great medical public system. So psychedelic medicine will be incorporated under the existing paradigms unless we do something proactive to change that.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And to echo that point, with the UN treaty and the US initiating this irrational drug war, is that before there were thousands of people being treated with things like LSD for alcohol use disorders, for depression, anxiety. So it's not like that this wasn't happening prior to the drug war and drug prohibition. So there was a robust field before as well, and now it's starting to come back.
Mm, right. Um, Bia, does it seem like the United States may legalize psychedelics on the federal level at some point in the future?
Well, I guess you will all have noticed that perhaps I'm a little biased because I am an activist, I'm an author and speaker and intellectual that believes in the potential healings of these medicines. So I think it's up to us to build the future we want. And so for that, I will answer yes. I do believe and I do hope. And I sincerely think that if we look 100 years from now, we're going to be so ashamed of where we are at, like when we think that there was a time that women couldn't vote, or there was a time where we were making other people our slaves, or all the brutalities that we have committed as societies. I think we will look at the current drug war with the same kind of eyes that we use toward to look at these other acts that today we consider barbaric, and how and ashamed of us as society. So putting people on jail for having their choices when they're not harming anybody is just a brutal attack of human rights, of the rights of sovereignty over the body and autonomy and religion and thought and privacy. And it's not working. It's a chaos. The drug war has imprisoned a lot of people. It imprisoned 3 times more people of color than their white peers for the same quantities of drugs. It's a racist war. It has persecuted minorities and has used this as a pretext to combat certain kinds of people. And it's just not efficient. Drugs have been rising the use, and you can't control quality. You can't protect the youth. So I think that the future is legalization of decriminalization and legalization of all drugs. And it's a paradoxical situation when you can have access on state level, but not on federal level, because you continue to be constantly persecuted. You continue to suffer that ambiguity. And this is not just like a big moral, existential, esoterical thing. It's a very day-to-day thing. I can share my own experience opening a bank account. We have this nonprofit called the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines. And then we go there, and I was rejected in 3 banks because they put the word psychedelics there, and it falls in their system to cannabis. So I'm explaining, but I'm not selling anything. I'm not selling cannabis. I'm not a dispensary. We just talk, blah, blah, blah. We just talk about drugs. We don't deal drugs. We just promote education. No. And then, finally I found one bank that could, we had a system transfer wise. We were blocked because they said that we were in favor of legalization of cannabis and the clinical trials to show the potential, the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. And I said, hell yeah, we are in favor. For that, we got kicked out of TransferWise. I can't pay any of our collaborators abroad and had to look for another platform. So this sort of thing, you know, it exists, it creates a confusion, state and federal. So there's a lot of layers of ambiguity. There's a huge moral and religious stigma. There's a huge legacy from the biomedical apparatus that considers this, kind of perversion of illusion or false or psychomimetic, imitating like psychotic breaks. So the moral, the legal, the medical, and the bureaucratic, and the future is to advance, to keep on advancing this reform. And the good thing is that everybody seems to be finally catching on, including things like the American Psychiatry Association. The mainstream institutions are finally recognizing the benefits of psychedelics. I think it's a world, it's a road that is forth. There is no back from this. But there are always the opponents, that are still crying and trying to stop the process. But I think we're moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, you were talking a bit about some of the critics of legalizing psychedelic medicines. Um, are there any points that these critics have made that have any research, available that supports these counterpoints?
No, absolutely not. So when you look at a place like Portugal that's decriminalized possession, all of their health outcomes improved. We would have less people in incarceration spaces, which are the most public harm you can possibly cause. So it costs much more. And a lot of people in our jails and prisons have a mental illness as well. So in my county, roughly 40% of people who go to jail or 40% of people who go to state prisons from my county here in Oakland are basically have a mental illness. And so we're not really caring for people, which would be a lot more cost effective. And psychedelics potentially allow one means to provide care and to address the roots of these problems instead of wasting more money on an inefficient system that continues to exacerbate public harm.
Yeah. Bia, what do you hope for the future of the psychedelic medicine field in the United States?
I hope for more compassion. I hope that people can listen each other more. I hope that the authorities give more money for research. I think this is something that everybody can agree, whichever side of the spectrum you're on. I mean, you really need to put dollars into this. There is no question about it. And also, you just need research that is not just focused on showing the harms, because let's try to see, fund research to see how cannabis can create whatever kinds of damages. But what about pouring research dollars into finding the potential therapeutic benefits of cannabis and all the other substances? That's also a problem with the research, official funded research that we have had, that has stimulated much more research on harms than research on benefits. So I hope we have more money for research and more money for research on benefits. And then I hope we can allow legal conditions for people to practice their spirituality. And so there's a huge amount of people in our Chacruna Institute. Chacruna means ayahuasca. It's the leaf, in Quechua, the leaf that makes ayahuasca, which is a sacred plant from the Amazon. Our nonprofit is named after that, because we are related to this world of plant medicine, of sacred uses, ceremony, tradition, ritual, indigenous people. And so there is a large community, a number of endless circle of people practicing ayahuasca rituals in the US. There's also psilocybin churches and organizations, or in San Pedro ones and peyote ones. So there's a whole set of people that practice this sort of spirituality, more contemporary and more hybrid, and perhaps not exactly the same as, Christianity, Judaism, or Islamism, but nevertheless legitimate forms of expression. So I think the future is the tolerance of the multiple models, is the advancement of research, is the development of clinical trials, is finding new substances for new kinds, for other kinds of disorders. We have published an article recently in Chacruna about a person that is saying that psychedelics help, with the critical period of formation of the brain. So maybe you could have a potential in treating people that suffered stroke. We're like, imagine you're sitting on the top of this iceberg. That's what we are. We have a whole world underneath, to be explored, to be discovered, to be relied. We can, as a society, organize ourselves, count with genial minds like Dr. Kelan Thomas, prolific author. Recommend everybody reads his papers in our site. And count with medical knowledge, count with the knowledge of users, count with the knowledge of religious practitioners, count with artists and creatives, and make conversations, advance this with compassion, with rationality, without fear, without stigma, with education, and with recognizing that the substances can be very powerful and very strong, and they can have really negative effects. And it's in our best interest to gear this in responsible, integrated, mature, open, and transparent conversations, because it's not by creating lies to our teenagers that we're going to keep them away from drugs. And that's what we're doing as society today. In this regard, I congratulate this venue for taking the initiative to bring this important conversation for an audience that perhaps is not so familiar with these topics.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think our audience of pharmacists, maybe are less informed about this field due to the legality issues. So raising greater awareness is absolutely key. On that point, Kellen, could pharmacists play a role in the future of psychedelic medicine that is more, as Bia was saying, more compassionate and aware of its potential?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's definitely a role, as sort of the drug experts of a healthcare team, particularly as MDMA and psilocybin become FDA approved medications, that it'll be imperative that we start to change our training. And actually, I just came from the like I said, this ASCP conference, and there's already people, proposing and having posters about educational programming and medical residencies and pharmacy schools, pharmacy residency programs, et cetera. So all of this is already beginning to happen. I know I talk about it in my program, and other professors are as well. Recently, the College of Psychiatric and Neurologic Pharmacists last year had a speaker, Fred Barrett from Johns Hopkins, who's doing this research. So there's an adoption across all of the medical and pharmacy institutions that will slowly, start to become more educated on this topic. And I think there's a big role for pharmacists to play to help reduce any harms associated with mixing medications and things like this. So
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
thank you.